Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today's mission is custom tailored for you. We're diving deep into some pretty complex historical and geopolitical sources. We're trying to analyze centuries, really, of Russia's identity struggle.
Yeah, it's a big one.
Right. And we're focusing on understanding the current geopolitical moment through this lens of Russia's Great Awakening. That's a fundamental realization about its place in the world. Our source material, it actually draws these philosophical parallels, calling it Dache Dawu. Now, this isn't just about, politics today. It's about a really deep, painful historical pattern. We're unpacking this tension, this push and pull between Russia wanting to join the West for centuries, and yet also fiercely sticking to its own indigenous civilization.
And what's really fascinating, I think, is how the sources approach Russia, not just as a state, right, but as a civilization, one that's deeply prone to this kind of theoretical, philosophical searching. Its whole path, its national journey, has been shaped by this internal split.
The internal split.
Exactly. And about that term, Dache Dawu, means a great, thorough awakening. Basically a profound realization. The sources use it very specifically because they argue Russia, maybe like quite a few non-Western nations, has hit this shared moment of clarity, realizing that the current global system, well, maybe it's fundamentally designed to keep them out, or at least not let them in at the top table.
Exclusion by design, almost.
That's the argument presented, yes. So the core question we're trying to answer today is, simple but huge. After all these centuries of trying to fit in, what truth did Russia finally grasp about its relationship with the West? And maybe more importantly, why is that realization now shaping this global shift we're seeing towards a multipolar world?
Okay, let's dig into those historical roots then. Because the sources really insist this conflict is like baked into Russia's cultural DNA. It goes way back 18th century. Peter the Great.
Peter the Great, yeah. His reforms were, well, they were radical for the time.
Absolutely. And they immediately created this cultural wedge, didn't they? Pushing the imperial family, the top aristocracy, towards total westernization.
They started pursuing things like intermarriage with Western royalty, importing European customs, fashion, language.
Our sources mentioned this was a very conscious effort, trying to shed that barbarian label left over from the Mongol era.
Oh, it ran deep. The sources give these really telling details. Like in the imperial court, speaking French wasn't just, fashionable. It was often almost necessary to be seen as part of the sophisticated elite.
Wow.
Speaking Russian, that was often for the servants, or it marked you as, well, uncivilized. It shows you the kind of deep cultural inferiority complex they were fighting against.
But this westernizing elite, they immediately ran into opposition,
Yeah.
like strong counterforce.
Exactly. The local party, you could call it, or Autotunas, is the term used. This group, it was backed by the smaller nobles and, crucially, by the very powerful Orthodox Church. And they had a completely different idea.
Different foundation.
Totally different. They saw Russia as the true, legitimate successor to the Roman Empire, the Third Rome, inheriting the Eastern Orthodox legal and spiritual tradition after Constantinople fell.
And just to underline that for you, the listener, the word Tsar itself is just the Russian way of saying Caesar. They weren't just borrowing a fancy title. They were claiming an entire legacy, a spiritual mandate almost.
And that claim immediately put them in direct spiritual competition with the Catholic and Protestant West. So this conflict, Westernizers versus the local traditionalists, it never really stopped. It just, changed its appearance over time.
Rulers had to keep balancing between them.
Constantly. Oscillating between these two poles, it was a permanent feature. And this internal spiritual political crisis, it's literally symbolized by that double-headed eagle emblem.
Ah, right. Looking both ways.
Precisely. The sources describe it poetically almost. A massive Eastern body being constantly tugged in the opposite direction by a feeble Western culture.
Yeah.
It's this image of a constant, painful internal struggle.
So if the conflict was that deep, what on earth could actually unify these two factions? Was there anything?
Just one thing, historically speaking, according to these analyses, external expansionist Slavism, meaning aggression, territorial growth. That was the only shared goal, the only common project that could bring both the westernizing elites and the traditionalists together under the Tsardom. And that shared drive is a big reason why Russian history is so defined by expansion into this huge territory.
But the core internal conflict, that cultural DNA you mentioned, that just carried on, even into the Soviet era.
It persisted, yes, right through.
Okay, so let's transition to the Soviet period, because this is where that historical DNA seems to play out in a really disastrous way.
Yeah.
Lots of people look at the collapse of the USSR and just see, okay, socialism failed. Simple as that. But our sources, they point to something more complex. A cultural failure tied to that persistent westernizing tendency among the elite.
That's right. I mean, the collapse was definitely a policy failure, too. You can't deny that. Inheriting Tsarist expansionism, sometimes deviating from core Marxist ideas about liberating people, neglecting welfare for imperial rivalry, all that played a role. But the cultural aspect, the sources argue, was this powerful, enduring belief among many in the Soviet elite that the real way forward was adopting Western norms. They thought, basically, that the West held the keys to modernity, to success.
And the big test of that belief came right after the collapse, didn't it? What did post-Soviet Russia actually do that triggered this huge disillusionment the sources talk about?
Well, they went all in. They attempted radical, almost textbook Westernization. The Yeltsin era saw the implementation of shock therapy, and that policy was directly guided by American and Western economists.
Okay, shock therapy. Maybe unpack that a bit for us. What did that mean in practice?
Sure. So shock therapy was basically the super fast, radical liberalization and privatization of state assets and markets. Everything opened up overnight almost.
And you called the result a catastrophe earlier. What did that actually look like for ordinary Russians? Can the sources give us a sense of that?
Oh, it was. Devastating is the word used. Repeatedly. The sources talk about national bankruptcy. Hyperinflation just wiped out people's life savings. State assets, oil, gas, major industries were basically looted, sold off cheap, divided up by Western capital and the oligarchs they sponsored.
So massive wealth transfer.
Huge, leading to mass impoverishment, unbelievable inequality, and this profound sense of national humiliation. Life expectancy actually dropped in some areas. It was a traumatic period.
That sounds like the moment of betrayal you mentioned.
That's exactly how it's framed. This experience, this shock therapy disaster, profoundly revealed Russia's true status or perceived status as an outsider within the Western international system.
That's a really crucial distinction. What did the sources reveal about the nature of that Western system as Russia saw it during this time?
They argue it's inherently structured like a pyramid. The G7 nations, the historically Christian majority countries, they're firmly at the top. And Russia, being Eastern Orthodox heresy in this view, was just never going to be allowed a genuine leadership role. It couldn't join the club as an equal.
And the proof?
The proof, according to the sources, was the kind of condescending attitude from the U.S. in particular. The infamous description cited is mocking Russia as just a shithole with nuclear weapons.
Oof, that kind of dismissal. It suggests that even if they played by the economic rules, like with shock therapy, it wasn't enough for real inclusion.
Absolutely not. And this is the trigger point for the Great Awakening. It wasn't just the public feeling this. Even figures who were previously very pro-Western, like former Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, eventually recognized it. When the West started imposing massive sanctions later on, the sources say they basically threw out their own rule book.
How so?
Principles like the sanctity of private property, the rule of law in economics, suddenly didn't apply when it came to Russian assets. They treated the whole global economic order like, quote, a war without rules.
So the realization was the Western principles are conditional, applied only when convenient for them.
That was the perception, yes. A deep sense of betrayal and the realization that the rules were different for Russia.
So that suffering, the bankruptcy, the poverty, the humiliation that created the fertile ground for this huge ideological shift, this awakening sounds less like a strategic choice and more like a necessary reaction, a survival mechanism.
It's presented exactly as a necessity. The sheer pain of the 90s forced this resurgence of indigenous nationalism, of populism. And that, in turn, forced the elite to fundamentally rethink Russia's path. They couldn't just keep trying to imitate the West. So the search for a new, coherent identity is now centered on ideas like Eurasianism and the concept of the Russian world.
Okay, let's define those terms a bit. They're key to this new ideology. What does Eurasianism emphasize that, in their view, Western liberalism doesn't?
Well, Eurasianism, as the sources frame it, is the search for a third way. It's neither purely Western, nor is it a return to the Soviet model. It puts a heavy emphasis on things like strong statehood, a sense of collectivism over radical individualism, morality, traditional family structures. And these are often explicitly linked to Eastern Orthodox traditions.
And how does that contrast with their view of Western liberalism?
They see it as a necessary counterweight to what they perceive in Western liberalism as an overemphasis on individual rights without corresponding obligations to the community or the state. That's the critique.
Right. And as Russia looks around for, successful economic models to support this independence, where are they turning?
They're looking east, primarily. The sources say Russian thinkers are now widely studying and admiring China's model, specifically its capacity for long-term strategic planning, state intervention, macro control. They see China as the clear economic leader of the non-Western world.
A powerful example of success without Westernizing.
Exactly, a non-Western success story that resonates.
So the ultimate aim of this awakening, it's not just about internal identity. It's about geopolitics. It's about reversing what the sources called a great shame.
Precisely. The goal is to restore Russia as an independent bloc, an independent pole in the global system. They simply cannot tolerate being, as they saw it, pushed to the periphery, treated merely as a resource supplier for the West. That's the legacy of the shock therapy years they're reacting against.
Okay, so that drive for an independent pole brings us right up to the present day. And our sources argue the conflicts we see now, they're not just political squabbles over borders. They reflect something deeper, a civilizational conflict, specifically Slavic civilization versus Anglo-Saxon civilization.
Yes, and this claimed animosity, it's rooted deep in history. If you connect back to the Tsarist era, that inferiority complex wasn't just made up. There are historical accounts, sources mention, of some Western Europeans holding these incredibly prejudiced views, viewing Slavs almost contemptuously as white-skinned Tatars.
Wow, that's quite an insult.
It is. It connects directly back to that historical shame of the Mongol invasion, implying they aren't really properly European.
And the religious angle, the Third Rome idea.
That's crucial too, because if Eastern Orthodoxy sees itself as the true Roman tradition, that puts it in direct competition with the Catholic and Protestant West for moral and spiritual legitimacy. The animosity isn't just political, it's about who holds the rightful claim to the legacy of Rome, to moral supremacy.
And this difference, this civilizational clash, it apparently extends to geopolitical strategy today. How do the sources contrast, say, the U.S. Western approach with China's?
Yeah, the sources are very direct in their framing here. The U.S. and Western approach things like NATO expansion, the Indo-Pacific strategy, it's characterized as, frankly, traditional, even backward imperialism.
Backward? How so?
Military-centric, fundamentally exclusionist, designed to contain, surround, or even ultimately dismember rivals. It's portrayed as a very old-school, zero-sum game.
And the alternative model, the one being championed by partners like China.
That would be China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI. The sources frame this as a much more advanced concept, based on mutual benefit, co-consultation, co-construction, co-sharing. It focuses heavily on economic development, infrastructure, and crucially, non-interference in internal affairs.
Which explains its appeal in the developing world.
Absolutely. That's why it's been welcomed by many nations who are tired of the old strings-attached, often military-led Western approach. And this brings up a really important point the material makes. Ultimate victory in this global competition, it hinges on having an advanced ideology. But, and this is key, the ideology must be backed by strong national power. You need both.
So it's a battle of ideas and strength combined.
Right. And the current composite warfare, which includes military, political, economic, informational, and this deep civilizational aspect, it's incredibly difficult to bridge. Especially, the sources argue, given the Western view of its own system as uniquely superior and maybe fundamentally non-inclusive to outsiders like Russia.
Okay. We've covered a huge sweep of history today. We've traced Russia's centuries-long desire, or at least the elite's desire, to join the West, and how that was finally shattered by what leaders and the population experienced as betrayal and predatory action, especially during the Yeltsin years. The big lesson here, according to the sources we've looked at, seems to be the fundamental difficulty, maybe impossibility, of fully integrating a civilization seen as heretical or just fundamentally other into a Western-led framework built on, well, exclusivity.
Yeah, I think this deep dive really shows that the current pushback from Russia, it isn't just reactive. It's not just Putin making decisions in a vacuum. It's rooted in this deeper cultural and philosophical quest for an independent identity, for meaning. The sources really stress that a nation needs a firm state concept, a guiding ideology like this Eurasianism they're developing, to avoid the kind of decay and fragmentation that almost destroyed them in the 90s.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, trying to make sense of the world stage? Well, Russia's really difficult, painful awakening offers this powerful case study. It highlights the dangers, perhaps, of losing faith in your own national path, your own ideology, and maybe the impossibility of achieving a genuine, respectful partnership within a system that might inherently view you as peripheral or even a threat. That realization has undeniably changed the global order.
And perhaps here's a final provocative thought for you to mull over, drawn from the sources. They note that history often seems to spiral, to return to earlier points. As the world clearly moves towards some kind of new multipolar structure still forming, still messy, Russia finds itself caught between this potential Eurasianist future and the ghosts of its past. Will it manage to forge a stable, independent path? Or could the immense pressures of this global competition cause it to relapse, perhaps into extreme nationalism, or maybe even back towards some new, maybe different form of dependency? How Russia resolves this deep identity crisis, well, that won't just shape Russia's own destiny. It's going to be a major factor in shaping the emerging global order for all of us for decades to come.